long-expected war came in September 1939. The new King George, one of the earliest pilots in the RAF, sent a message to his old service. The Royal Air Force will have to assume responsibilities greater than in the last war. One of the greatest will be the safeguarding of these islands. I can assure all ranks of my confidence in their skill and courage. In the Commonwealth, and later America, huge flying schools were started. Thousands who'd never been in the air before had to be taught to fly and navigate in all weathers, and to fight a clever and aggressive enemy. The German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, mainly supported the German army. Its aircraft were designed primarily as battlefield weapons to terrorize the enemy and blast a path for the soldiers. Then to carry shock troops rapidly forward to surprise the defenses. These blitzkrieg tactics devastated Poland in a few days, then tore into Denmark and Norway, Holland, Belgium and France, leaving a trail of ruin and suffering. The Germans caught many air forces off guard, destroyed them on the ground, then quickly took over their airfields. We found we didn't know a thing about air warfare. Our poor old battles and Blenheims were hacked down, regardless of personal bravery. Only the 8-gun Hurricanes could outfight the enemy, and the courage of their pilots became a legend. But when France fell, the RAF had lost nearly 1,000 aircraft, and worse, hundreds of highly trained men. Defense fighters from Britain, heavily outnumbered, did their best to cover the Dunkirk evacuation. As Churchill said, there was a victory inside this deliverance, gained by the Royal Air Force. The Battle of France is over. The Battle of Britain is about to begin. Goering promised Hitler air supremacy over England. The German invasion plan was for 3 air fleets to converge on Britain and destroy shipping, radar stations, and airfields. When air supremacy had been achieved, the bombers would soften up the coastal defenses and airborne troops would spearhead the assault. The invading armies would follow in fleets of barges and Britain would be conquered. The Luftwaffe started the battle in July 1940 with attacks on shipping. Although fighter defense was difficult so far from land, the tonnage sunk was modest. Our radar stations warned on August the 12th that huge air fleets were approaching. As they crossed the coast, the Royal Observer Corps reported the size and direction of each raid. The Germans fielded some 2,500 bombers and fighters, odds of 4 to 1 against us. But the home team had been training in air defense for years. The height, course, and strength of enemy formations were passed to the fighter squadrons, which were waiting on standby until the bandits came within range. We were on standby from dawn to dusk, 18 hours, and we had to while away the time at dispersal. Long, boring hours, until the phone rang. Then, 2 minutes to take off. The Luftwaffe believed their aircraft, which had shattered Europe, would crush the RAF in only 4 days. But each new wave of bombers was fiercely challenged as they tried to destroy our radar stations and coastal airfields. We disliked the black crosses and the crooked swastikas. Who the hell were these ugly bastards to come into our sky and bomb our people? He tried to bounce them from behind. He only had enough ammo for a couple of dozen bursts,
Sorry you didn't waste the stuff.
After 10 days of battle, the Luftwaffe had lost many more aircraft than the RAF. Their bombs damaged a number of our airfields, but the air defense system was unbroken.
Often, within minutes of a raid, the beauty chorus, as we called them, were back on the air in full song. Our ground crews pressed on regardless, sparing no effort to get us back in the fray. Now we found swarms of 109s closely nursing the bombers. They only had fuel for a few minutes fighting, but we were losing a lot more chaps. Luckily, some stepped out and were picked up by the air sea rescue boys.
Still, the RAF was unbeaten. Goering's decision to escort his bombers had merely hindered his fighters. The Germans had now lost well over 1,000 aircraft. They had failed to win air superiority, so Hitler's invasion of Britain was postponed. Forever, it so happened. But our strength was also ebbing away, for 1,000 aircrew had been killed or wounded. Fewer than 3,000 had fought. About 1 in 5 of them had come from the Commonwealth, or were Czechs and Poles, Free French and Belgians, or from America, Ireland, and Palestine. The few had saved more than Britain, but they were at the limit of endurance. Only the first phase of the battle was over. Frustrated, Hitler suddenly turned his bombers against London. But the Luftwaffe had not been trained for a long bombing offensive, and the strategic damage they caused was less than the human suffering. About 13,000 Londoners were killed in the Blitz, and many more were wounded. But each citizen killed cost a ton of bombs, and when Hitler had lost nearly 2,000 aircraft over Britain, he switched the attack to other vital targets, ports and industrial cities. After each raid, however hurtful, the people got on with the job. The Nazis had hoped the British would cry for mercy, but they cried only for their dead. Now the raiders came only by night, guided to their targets by radio beams. We learned to jam the beams and mislead the bombers. But night interception was still a game of catch as catch can. By 1941, ground control stations were able to guide night fighters to the nearest enemy. And the first airborne radar, which showed the fighter its quarry, was fitted to the Beaufighter, which was armed with 4 cannons and 6 machine guns. 2 bloody great engines, hotly pursued by an airframe. Soon, by night as well as day, the RAF held air superiority over Britain. The fighters are our salvation, but the bombers alone provide the means of victory. But it was 2 years before Bomber Command got the aircraft it needed to really hurt the enemy, the Lancaster. In May 1942, it gave proof of its new power. More than 1,000 bombers, 5 times more than ever before, flew on a single defiant raid. Veterans and new 4-engine giants had to be scraped together, even from the training units. For the first time, the bombers flew in a continuous stream to make a more concentrated attack. 1,500 tons of bombs were showered on Cologne in only 90 minutes, devastating the industrial city. This new policy of area bombing met Churchill's demand, "We must pulverize the entire industry on which the war effort of the enemy depends." Soon, our bombers were being guided to the target by radio navigational aids and a British-invented radar, H2S, which revealed the ground through cloud. Using such devices, the new Pathfinder force led the attack, locating and marking each target with flares. Now it was the Germans' turn to defend their homeland. Their night fighters, flak and radar grew stronger, and the bombers suffered. The British developed countermeasures like Winder, clouds of tinfoil strips, which blinded the German radar when heavy incendiary raids destroyed Hamburg. This was a terrible portent of future air power. An uncontrollable firestorm killed over 40,000 people, victims of the total war which the Nazis had started at Warsaw, Rotterdam, Coventry. The Luftwaffe reacted fiercely to the Holocaust of Hamburg. Led by experienced pilots and equipped with powerful aircraft, their air defense became grimly efficient. The American day bombers suffered worst. Although they were heavily armed to protect each other on unescorted raids, their tight formations were big targets for flak and fighters. The Americans, like the Germans and the British before them, learned that day bombers had to have fighter protection. The RAF bomber losses were also heavy, as this Luftwaffe trophy shows. The Dam Busters are still remembered with pride, the squadron which did such spectacular damage to the Ruhr in a single raid. But their leader, Guy Gibson, VC, remembered his crews. Of the 16 aircraft which crossed the enemy coast, 8 had been shot down. 56 men had gone, just some of many, for the scythe of war had reaped a bloody harvest in Bomber Command. The enemy aircraft industry was therefore a priority target. Despite our bombing, it was still growing and producing lethal new weapons, including the first jet fighters used in combat. Another vital target were the U-boat harbors. From the first day of war, enemy submarines had been sinking our vital supply ships. But it was at least 3 years before Coastal Command was given enough long-range aircraft to guard the ships in the transatlantic convoys. The Bay of Biscay harbored most of the U-boats, and Coastal Command hoped to spot them on radar before they escaped into the ocean depths. If they were caught on the surface, they were bombed. When they dived for safety, they were offered depth charges. Even at night, they were hunted with powerful searchlights. RAF aircraft were responsible for sinking or damaging more than 300 U-boats, and eventually, with the Navy, ensured that only 1 in 10 was operational. With its shorter-range aircraft, Coastal Command patrolled the shoreline of Hitler's fortress, attacking every possible maritime target.
Always too many jobs. Never enough aircraft or bots to service them.
Who's at the crack of dawning, outside at the twilight green? Who pulls his weight to keep the cradle set to make it great? When next you see a picture of plain and smiling crew, recall of rock what keeps it there, who's just an AC-2. Next time you praise the pilot as the enemy falls a wreck, remember the guy that doesn't fly the humble ground flight there.
Yet they soon became proud of their kite.
We had the cleanest perspex in the squadron. Polished it myself with blackouts, waff knickers.
And proud of the deeds of their aircrew.
There was always some artistic type to chalk up the score.
When you heard on the radio 3,000 tons were dropped, we'd had to load 3,000 tons.
The ceaseless toil of the armourers became more and more nerve-wracking as bombs became bigger and more specialised, ranging from tricky incendiaries to 10-ton earthquake bombs. Working or waiting, ground crews were under stress, marooned at cold, wet dispersals, miles from a cup of tea, straining to hear the drone of returning engines. At last, some came back. They'd come in with fuel tanks ripped open and engines wrecked, fabric burnt and metal like a sieve. Then we'd have to do a week's work in hours. Our motto, polite version, was "You bend 'em, we mend 'em," meaning bad maintenance may cost the lives of your friends. Working beside men in 80 trades, the gentle sex was an essential part of the team. From the friendly radio voices, which were the aircrew's only link with home, to the cooks who welcomed them back to a post-ops breakfast, the WAF were 180,000 strong. Enemy action took its toll of the ground crews, but thousands died from the stress and strain of the job. Climate was often their worst enemy.
It was either brass monkey weather or too blistering hot. In the desert, it was sand and more sand, seeping into engines, taking up controls, jamming guns. We always had to be stripping and lubricating everything, including the lags.
When the war began in Africa, the RAF had to rely largely on relics of the past to fight the Italians. All the modern aircraft were defending Britain. But the few veterans kept the whole Italian Air Force at bay. Once again, it was nearly 2 years before the Air Force was fully equipped to fight the Luftwaffe. In the vast desert, the aeroplane was no longer a subsidiary arm. It had become a major tactical weapon. Paving the way for every military offensive, protecting our army from air attacks, striking aggressively at all enemy movement, particularly convoys bringing reinforcements and supplies. Air transport was also becoming a major role, and in 2 years, Transport Command grew to 60 squadrons worldwide. The air movement of troops, the evacuation of casualties, and the ferrying of supplies became essential to both sides in the fast-moving desert war.
We knew our land, sea, and air commanders were a real team, planning operations together. When they gave us the GEN, this new cooperation filtered down to all ranks in the Desert Air Force. Nearly 100 squadrons of us from many countries.
The rapidly expanding Allied air power was supported by endless groundwork, by the spades of sappers building the landing strips, by the guns of the new RAF regiment, defending the airfields against intruders. By the salvage units retrieving repairable aircraft. And by the maintenance units rebuilding shattered airframes and sand-clogged engines faster than in England. Even in faraway West Africa, ground crews were assembling new airframes to be ferried 4,000 miles across the continent to the Desert Air Force. The Allies had learned that air superiority was the key to victory, so they had defeated the enemy's well-trained and equipped tactical air force. The Allied air commander praised his men. "You have shown the world the unity and strength of air power. A good job, well finished." And the King knighted an Air Force officer on the battlefield, the first such ceremony for 200 years. In July 1943, the Allies invaded Sicily en route for the Italian mainland, and the RAF provided nearly half the huge tactical air force of more than 250 squadrons. The comradeship born in the desert was still strong, and in many units, air and ground crews shared the work and the living. The natives seemed friendly, and when they'd kicked out Mussolini, the Italians changed colors overnight from enemies to allies. Christmas dinner was eaten in the sunny south, but the outlook changed as the Allied armies battered their way north through the mud. For nearly 2 years more, the Germans fought a brilliant delaying retreat, but they'd lost their command of the air. The Allied bombers were able to concentrate on destroying the enemy's strong points, or cutting the few road and rail links with the northern supply depots, thereby starving the German army of fuel and ammunition. When victory came, soldiers, sailors, and airmen, in close partnership, had liberated the Italian people. The prelude to the Allied invasion of northwest Europe was a vast scheme of aerial demolition. Thousands of tons of bombs paralyzed fortifications, airfields, communications, and ports. Rocket-firing fighters and light bombers made countless low-level attacks on the enemy coastline, straining the Luftwaffe to breaking point. For we had learned from the Germans' failure in the Battle of Britain that we must win complete air supremacy over the invasion area to have a chance of victory. On D-Day, June the 6th, 1944, the great assault started. There was little opposition from the Luftwaffe, for our air superiority over the Channel had prevented them from discovering the size and place of the invasion. It was a German general who declared, "Air reconnaissance will win the next war." The RAF had put increasing faith in its photographic reconnaissance units. Long before D-Day, they had discovered secret German weapons at Peenemünde on the Baltic coast. Small pilotless aircraft, perhaps flying bombs, and monstrous rocket-powered missiles. The testing grounds were bombed repeatedly. Nevertheless, the first reprisal weapons, V-1s, were launched against Britain shortly after we invaded Europe. Many of these 400-mile-an-hour doodlebugs were destroyed by the guns as they crossed the coast. As many more were shot down by our fastest new fighters. Among them, the jet-engined Meteors, first fruit of Whittle's long research. About half the V-1s were destroyed, but the rest got through. Then came the V-2 rockets, and there was no defense against them. The V-weapons took many lives, but they might have altered the course of the war if the launch sites had not been battered daily by the Allied air forces. When most of France and Belgium had been liberated, an Allied airborne army, the biggest ever, made a bold attempt to shorten the war by crossing the Rhine at Arnhem, behind the German defense line. The first lift of airborne troops held their ground. But reinforcements, delayed by bad weather, faced heavy fire, and the savage fight was lost. Yet the bravery of the transport command crews and of the airborne forces they carried into the battle will forever honor the name of Arnhem. RAF Bomber Command by night and the Americans by day had cut deeper into the Reich each year. From mid-42 to mid-43, they dropped nearly 100,000 tons. In the next 12 months, 4 times as much. And in the last 12 months of the war, about 1 million tons of bombs. All Nazi-occupied Europe was now within range of the Allied air forces, and special bombs were being used to destroy targets which had long seemed impregnable. The Allied air offensive dislocated enemy industries, dams and power supplies, railways and canals. It attacked Hitler's most powerful weapons, U-boats, aircraft and engines, long-range missiles, and the oil that fueled Germany. In the final months, the bombers concentrated mainly on the oil plants. Slowly, the Nazi war machine ground to a halt. Hitler once said, "Give me 5 years and you will not recognize Germany again." Years later, his armaments minister, Speer, recalled, "Defense against air attack required thousands of guns and hundreds of thousands of soldiers. This was the greatest battle lost on the German side." The bombers alone could not make Germany collapse, but they greatly weakened her power to wage war. On May the 8th, 1945, the Third Reich surrendered. But our other enemy, the Japanese, were still undefeated. Their early victories owed much to their air forces, whose performance and striking power had taken the Americans utterly by surprise at Pearl Harbor. Our Far East Air Force had been too small and obsolete to halt the Japanese assault on Malaya. And Singapore surrendered. The British were driven back through Burma to India, where a few surviving RAF aircraft took to the streets to defend Calcutta against enemy air attacks. Patiently, the RAF began rebuilding its strength. A trickle of new aircraft was grudgingly spared from the battles in the West, and all such gifts were gratefully received.
O God, our Father, have mercy, we beseech thee, on those who shall be...
The climate, as usual, wasn't much help. Hot, stinking dust everywhere. And the rain came, the monsoon. The landing strip was a lake in no time. What with the wind and us up to our necks in mud, maintenance was a ruddy miracle.
The airmen often lived in a malarial quagmire, yet like the rest of the forgotten army, their spirit was unbeatable. Unarmed transport aircraft played the biggest role, airlifting sometimes 90% of the needs of all the troops fighting in the inaccessible jungle. The Chindits, led by the unorthodox General Wingate, were operating hundreds of miles behind the enemy lines. Airdrops down the chimney were the only way they could replenish food, arms, and medical supplies. Eventually, the dependence on air transport to supply our armies became the key to victory in Southeast Asia.
We also make use of darkness and bad weather.
In 2 years, the RAF survivors from Singapore became 50 squadrons. Many of them equipped with American aircraft on a lease-lend basis. Throughout 1944, the United British, Dominions, and American Air Forces used every available aircraft as tactical weapons in the bloody battles to recapture Burma, flying untold hours, often through tropical storms, over country where forced landings were usually fatal. The brave, but unforgettably ruthless Japanese were retreating by the summer of '45, but our victory seemed a long way off, with countless casualties along the road. Then, in one moment of agony, the war was over. Thousands of lives had been sacrificed to save maybe millions. For in that moment, the threat of the deterrent was born. As Churchill put it, perhaps safety will be the sturdy child of terror, and survival the twin brother of annihilation. With the coming of peace, the Royal Air Force turned thankfully to missions of mercy, flying home a small army of prisoners of war and repatriating foreign families who'd fled to Britain to escape the Nazis. As the flying tasks dwindled, hundreds of thousands who'd rallied from all over the world to wear RAF blue, many of them from the Dominions and the countries of our allies, slipped quietly back to normal life. But 1 in every 5 of the men who'd flown would never make it, nor would nearly 10,000 of their ground crews. The Royal Air Force had been embattled almost continuously throughout its existence. Its people, so many of whom had given their lives, inspired those that followed them. In the words of a former Chief of the Air Staff, Sir John Grandy, "We have always been a service of individuals, working and fighting as a team. So often the success of an operation depended on the ability, determination, and courage of just one person, in an aircraft, a servicing team, or an operations room. All of us can look back with pride at the progress made by our service and at the people who made it possible."
Bless them all, the long and the short and the tall. Bless all the sergeants and WO1s, bless all the corporals and their blooming sons. We're saying goodbye to them all, as back to the village they crawl. You'll get no promotion this side of the ocean, so cheer up my lad, bless them all. There's many an airman just finished his time, and many a trot signing on. They'll get no promotion this side of the ocean, so cheer up my lad, bless them all. Bless them all, bless them all, the long and the short and the tall. Bless all the sergeants and WO1s, bless all the corporals and their blooming sons, for they're saying goodbye to them all, and back to the barracks they crawl. You'll get no promotion this side of the ocean,